How many of you guys have heard of this game right up here called Fortnite? You guys ever heard of this? You are very excited about this. This is going to be your favorite day in church. Anyways, this is a game that is so popular. It is a phenom. I mean, just what's happening with it and things that are going on with this game. I mean, it's just everywhere right now. And I was thinking about that this week, and so I started to do a little bit of research on the game Fortnite. And what I discovered in terms of how many people are actually playing this game and how many users there are, that worldwide, when it comes to Fortnite, there's 125 million subscribers worldwide. And that's crazy to think about. I mean, that's just kind of mind-boggling. That's about a third of the United States of America's population is playing Fortnite. I mean, that's just wild. As I thought about that, I also thought about just the game itself. You know, with that many subscribers, I'm curious how much money this game is actually making. And so I started looking into this, and Fortnite was actually launched in September of last year, so it's about 10 or 11 months old. And in that 10-month period, to 11 month period, it has made over $1.2 billion. And I'm thinking to myself, that's one game, not like a whole catalog of games, right? That's not a whole lifetime of games. That is one single game in 10 months, $1.2 billion. That's insane. And then think about this. This year in April, the game Fortnite made $296 million in 1 month. That is just beyond our minds to think about. And then this year in 2018, Fortnite is projected to make over $2 billion. One single game, over $2 billion. That's just nutty. And as I think about the game, you know, this week I was thinking about all that and how many subscribers and how much money they're making. I mean, it really is a phenomenon. As I thought about that, I had this other thought to go, they have had to figure it out, or somehow they figured out with their programmers to kind of program into the game some subliminal or some kind of psychological drug thing. I don't know. Because here's the deal. I mean, so many people are addicted to Fortnite. It's so addicting. And the reason I can say this is because I have 5 sons. And my 5 sons are part of the 125 million subscribers. And I'm telling you, I think they're addicted. I mean, I watch what happens, and they just can't get enough of this game. They're playing it for hours, and they're give me more and more. You know, it consumes them. It kind of blinds them as well. Because, you know, just a few days ago, I walked into the room and they were all playing Fortnite and they've been playing for 3 hours. And I walked in and I was like, okay, boys, you know, we take a break, maybe have lunch or whatever? And they looked at me and they said, Dad, don't you love me? And I'm like, my love is somehow equated to that. What is going on? A little break is fine. It's just amazing to me. And so because of this, because I'm seeing what I'm seeing with my boys, and sometimes I feel like they're little zombies. I'm like, what's going on? Right? Because of that, a few days ago, I had to have one of these with my boys, a hard conversation. And we sat down and we're in my living room and talking to the boys. And I'm like, okay, boys, here's the deal. I'm not against it. I want you to enjoy it, but it's starting to consume you. Seems like it's kind of controlling. It feels like it's a little bit blinding because I let you play a bunch and you're like, it's not enough. So I said, we're going to have to put some boundaries around this. We're going to have to put, in essence, some guardrails. And so I began to describe what those are, and I just said, hey, you can only play this much and all that kind of stuff. And, I'm watching them squirm and be like, oh, this is terrible, right? And then they make this comment, no kidding, after we kind of set this up and they can't play as much as they, were previously playing, they asked me the question. They said, Dad, what are we going to do? I was like, live, go outside. Have some time with your father. I want to connect with you. It's just unbelievable. I mean, it is a phenomenon, the whole game Fortnite. Again, and I share that not to say I'm against it or anything. It's just a wild thing to make an observation about. And honestly, the real reason why, I share all of that with you, and the real reason we're talking about this is because not only did I have a hard conversation a few days ago with my boys, but guys, today we're going to have a hard conversation. We're going to have a conversation around something that we typically don't like to talk about. We're going to talk about something that I think for all of us, me included, has the power to control us, has the power to kind of blind us to some things in our life. Today, we're going to have a hard conversation around money. And I know that there's tension when we talk about this, but we've got to talk about it. We've got to talk about how do we put some financial guardrails around money. And the reason why we're talking about guardrails and the reason why, financial guardrails is because we're wrapping up the series today called Guardrails. And throughout the series, the very thing we've said is, we've said we all know what guardrails are, that we see them on highways and roadways, we see them in bridges and medians, and we all get the purpose of a guardrail. I mean, a guardrail is there to protect you. A guardrail is there to kind of minimize the damage. You may have hit the guardrail, but at least you didn't go over the cliff, right? It minimizes damage. And what we've said throughout the whole series is not only do we need guardrails on roadways and highways, but we need guardrails in our lives. Because if we're really honest with one another, I think all of us can reflect and think about our lives and say, some of our greatest regrets in life, our greatest regrets in that relationship, dating relationship with our parents, with our kids, with marriage, at work, all these things, those greatest regrets could have been prevented or even minimized if we had simply established some guardrails. Some marriage guardrails, some parenting guardrails, some ethical guardrails, some professional guardrails. That's why we're talking about this. And today, what I want us to do is have a hard conversation around money. Specifically, I want to talk about some financial guardrails. And again, as I alluded to, guys, I get it. I know when we talk about money in church, there's this tension, there's emotion involved, that our kind of internal lawyers, the volume goes louder and we want to push back. And I just want to acknowledge that. And I'm not telling you to turn off your internal lawyer or anything like that and push back against the things. I'm not telling you not to do that. I just want to recognize that. And I also want to recognize the fact that when we talk about money in church, that there's this little voice inside of us. And sometimes that little voice says something like this. Says, when it comes to the church, it just wants my money. The church just wants it. That's why that's why we're really talking about it. And listen, I get it. And if I was in your shoes and I had heard the things you've heard and I've experienced the things you experienced and I've seen the things you've seen, you know what? I bet I would probably say the same thing. But the reason why we're talking about this and the reason why we've got to talk about financial guardrails is because Jesus said way too much about money. In fact, Jesus talked about money more than any other practical subject that he spoke about. That any other practical point in your life and my life, kind of the rhythms of our life, he talked about money 10 times as much as he talked about all those areas. And the question is, why? Why did he do that? I mean, think about it this way. If I preached as much as Jesus preached about money, I can guarantee you I wouldn't have a job. Right? I think people would be like, it's just too much. It's just, he talked about it all the time, and there was a reason he did that. And today, I want to show you that reason. And today, if you're here and you hear this topic of money and financial guardrails, and you think to yourself, well, I've got tons of money. I've got millions of dollars in the bank. I mean, I don't need to hear this. Today, I want you to lean in. It's important to listen. Or if you're here today and you would say, no, I'm the opposite. When it comes to money, I'm in such debt and I just have no money and that kind of, wherever you're at on the spectrum of finances, I think all of us need to lean in a little bit and listen to the words of Jesus. Because regardless if you have a lot or very little, what Jesus has to say has huge implications that all of us can find ourselves in a financial ditch. So today, we're going to have a hard conversation about some financial guardrails. And we're going to hear from Jesus. And what's fascinating about Jesus, again, as I alluded to earlier, he talked about this all the time. But something else that's really wild about Jesus is that in the first century, wherever Jesus went, he had massive crowds. I mean, that's one of the big observations with Jesus. Everywhere he went, he had the crowd. That kind of, the first century, he had the power. Whoever had the crowd had the power. And in the crowds, the thing that was so unique about Jesus' crowds is they were mixed. I mean, it was just unheard of that you would have the religious and non-religious, that you would have the priest and the prostitute, you would have the priest and the tax collector. They would all be mixed in these crowds. And again, we hear that today and you're like, no big deal. But in the first century, you would have never seen this. It was so rare. And everywhere Jesus went, massive crowds, and there were always mixed crowds. And it was phenomenal. And on this particular day, in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus had this big crowd, thousands of individuals, and it was a mixed crowd. And he's talking about all these aspects of life, and then he gets to money. And Jesus says something really interesting about money. And here's what he says to that crowd, and here's what he says to us. He starts the whole conversation. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Now, it's important to understand what the word store means. Literally in the Greek, it means to stockpile or to hoard. It's this idea that Jesus is conveying to the crowd and to us. He's saying, listen, our temptation is to put our hope, our security, our worth, our value, our significance in our stuff. And so we got to get more of it and bigger and better and more and bigger and better and more. And Jesus says, don't do that. And again, today, if you feel tension, make sure you argue with Jesus, not with me. I'm just telling you what he said, right? But he said, don't do that. And the question is, why, Jesus? And he tells us, he says, because it's all going to wear out. It's pointless. Like at the end of the day, you're going to get this thing, but moth and rust are destroy. There's very little significance in those things. And we've all experienced that. We've all bought that car, those pair of clothes we had to have, or that thing, that gadget. And within a few years, literally, moths were destroying it. We've all experienced that. And that's Jesus' point. He says, don't do that. Instead, and he contrasts it, he says, but store, again, that idea of stockpile, up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. And again, we're like, well, how do you know we should do this, Jesus? How do you know what heaven's like? Well, Jesus in John 6 tells us. He says, for I have come down from heaven. In other words, guys, I've been there. That's where I came from. And I've seen the economy of heaven. I've seen the adventures of heaven. I've seen the experiences you can have in heaven. And as the Bible talks about heaven, it describes it as everything we love about earth times 10 to the 10th power. There's adventures to be had. There's experiences to be had. There's responsibilities. There's homes. There's, adventures. And Jesus says, guys, I'm for you. I really am for you. I know this is hard to hear and kind of countercultural, but he says, I'm for you. You never have to question if Jesus is for you. If somebody gives their life for you, dies for you, then they're for you. Jesus says, I'm for you. And do not store up for yourself treasure on earth. Store up for yourself treasure in heaven. In other words, think of it like an investment account that you can send things ahead to prepare for eternity. And then he answers the question. He says, why? Well, because thieves do not break in and steal. In other words, no one or nothing can mess with your investment. And you hear that, or at least I hear that, and I'm like, that's hard. Because my tendency is I want to store up things on earth. I got them now. They're tangible. I can touch them. Jesus, you're saying not to? What do you mean? Jesus, you're saying to store up treasure in heaven? That's going to require me to really trust you. And then Jesus moves on. And he says something that perhaps if you've grown up in church, you've heard this verse over and over and over. He says this verse. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, this is so important to understand. This is really the heart of Jesus' message. So I want to take just a second and try to the best of my ability explain what he's getting at. So think of it this way. In your personal life, think about this, is that every single one of us, we all treasure something. That every single one of us have a treasure in our soul, that we have a treasure in our heart, that there's something we treasure. Perhaps it's a certain status, maybe a certain kind of reputation, maybe a certain kind of, financial status, maybe a certain kind of look. You want to look a certain way, and if you just look this way, whatever you have to do to look that way, it's worth it. Maybe a certain house or a certain kind of, it's a family style or family experience, whatever it is. At the end of the day, every single one of us treasure something in our hearts. And with that treasure, it's beautiful. And with that treasure, we'll do anything to get it. In fact, think of it this way. Whatever that treasure is, we'll say, if I have this, it will all be worth it. If I have this, I will be worth it. If I have that certain financial status, I'm telling you, it took a lot of sacrifice. It took a lot of work, but it's all worth it, and I am worth it. Every single one of us have a treasure in our heart. As I thought about that, it reminded me of a movie that I think we're all somewhat familiar with. It's this one right here. You guys heard of The Lord of the Rings? It's kind of an old classic movie. Well, this whole movie is a fascinating movie, all kinds of symbolism in the movie. The whole movie is about this thing right here, a ring. And it's the power of the ring. And whoever has the ring has the power. And whoever has the ring comes under the power of the ring. And it can blind you, it can persuade you, it can control you, and you will do whatever you have to do to get the ring. And do you remember what they call the ring in the movie? Remember the name they use? Yeah. My precious. The precious. I'll do anything to get the precious. That's a treasure. That's the nature of the treasure in our heart, that we say we will do anything to get it. If I have this, it will be worth it, and I will be worth it. And what we need to understand when it comes to the treasures of our heart is the treasure of our heart will enslave us. It will. And if you don't like that terminology, then perhaps think of it this way, that we will do whatever we can to get that treasure. It's worth it, and I'll be worth it. And we've all seen this. We all have a friend or maybe a family member who said, you know what, I want that certain status or that certain title, or that certain accomplishment, and that's my treasure, and I will sacrifice whatever I have to get that thing. And we watched it from a distance, and we've seen them sacrifice the most valuable relationships in their lives. In other words, it's like that treasure. We'll do anything to get it. We'll actually die for it. And that's important to understand because of this statement right here. Every treasure will insist you die to purchase it. But Jesus is the one treasure that died to purchase you. Every treasure will say you must pay the cost. You must give your life for it. But Jesus is the only one who gave his life for you. And the question is why? Jesus, why would you do that? And think about the life of Jesus, what he gave away. I mean, he came from heaven to come into earth, and he was stripped naked. He was beat within an inch of his life. His flesh was ripped from his body. He was punched in the face. He was spit upon. He was falsely accused. Why would you do that, Jesus? The answer is because you'll do anything for your treasure, and you are his treasure. And you are his treasure. And you are his treasure. You see, when that begins to sink in to the depths of our heart and the depths of our soul, and we begin to really consider what God has done for us, it frees us. Think of it this way. Unless this statement here begins to sink into your soul that God was willing to lose all his treasure so you could be his treasure. Unless we can begin to feel what God feels for us. Unless we can pause long enough in our life to kind of go, oh my gosh, he gave everything. You know, the most famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16, for God so treasured the world that he gave his one and only son, that he exhausted everything. He couldn't give anything more away for you. And for you. And so that you can know you have value. So that you can know you are forgiven. So that you can know you have worth and significance. And so your security could be in him. Unless that begins to sink in to our souls and he becomes our treasure, we will never be free from money. And that's Jesus' point. Jesus' point is somebody's got your heart. Either God or money has your heart. And then Jesus moves on. And he says something that first, when we read this, it feels kind of like from left field. It's like, Jesus, what are you saying? But here's what he says. He continues the whole conversation. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? To which we read that and go, Jesus, I thought we were talking about money. Here we're talking about eyeballs and lights. Like, what is going on, right? So let me try to explain what Jesus is getting at, because it's a really simple concept. He's basically saying, hey, when your eyes are functional and healthy, when the lights are on with functional eyes, you can see everything. You can see shapes and colors and sizes. I mean, you can navigate around, right? But even if you have functional eyes and the lights are off and it's complete dark, then you lose, colors, you lose shapes, you lose the ability to navigate. And Jesus' point is he's saying, There is something inside of you and inside of me that if we don't pay attention to, could cause us to live with the lights on, but because that internal thing, we're living as if there is no light. That you can walk around in life and think, hey, the lights are on, but you're blinded to what's actually happening. So the question becomes, well, Jesus, then what is this? What is this thing that can happen inside of me? Well, the key to unlocking this passage is to understand the word healthy and unhealthy. Because healthy and unhealthy have a double meaning in the Greek. You know, it means healthy or generous. It means unhealthy or greedy. It's a double meaning. So let's read it this way. You could say the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are generous, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are greedy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? So Jesus, you're talking about greed and the power of greed. And he would say, yes, we got to pay attention. Watch out. In fact, greed by definition is this. If we're to think about greed, it's the inordinate desire or dependence on money and material things. And Jesus says, greed blinds. This is a sneaky one. This is one that's almost impossible to see, that greed blinds. And the question becomes, what does it blind us from? Well, greed blinds us from greed. That greed is almost impossible to see in our lives. I mean, think about it this way. If you were to get an email this last Friday, and it came from North Point, and the subject line of the email said, wrapping up Guardrails, part 4, talking about greed. That'd be a really long subject line. But if that was the case, and then the whole, context of the email, it's all about greed. I mean, how many of you would be excited to come to church today? I think most of us, we're not going to admit this typically, but most of us would go, there'd be no way I would come. Really? Why is that? Why is that? Because for most of us, we just feel like, well, I'm not greedy. I'm not greedy. I mean, my neighbor's greedy. That rich person, they're greedy, but me, I'm not greedy. You see, greed blinds us. Greed blinds us from our own greed. And not only does it do that, but when it comes to greed, greed is the sin of the eye. It's so interesting to think about greed. I mean, we can pretty much see all other sins, but greed is almost impossible to see. I mean, think of it this way. When it comes to adultery, it's not like the idea that you wake up one day and you're like, oh my gosh, you're not my wife. I had no idea, right? We don't think that way. We would go, of course you would know that. But greed is the sin of the eye. It's almost impossible to see in your life. And not only is it the sin of the eye, but greed isn't confessed. This is not something that we talk about on a regular basis, that we struggle with. So I thought about that this week. I thought to myself, I've been a pastor just over a decade. And in 10 years of being a pastor, part of my role is I've sat down with a lot of individuals and I've heard so many stories, and stories that personally just break my heart. And I hear stories of, struggle, and stories of individuals in their marriage, and here's what's going on in my marriage, and here's what's going on with this addiction, or here's what's going on personally, or, all these things. And I'm like, oh man, they're just, there's such struggles and hardships in life, and people will, just share those. And in over a decade of a pastor, I've heard pretty much, all kinds of stories, but not one time has anyone ever sat down and said, Buck, man, I'm struggling with greed. Can you help me with that? Can you help me overcome that? And that's, for me, kind of wild to think about. Because you think about the statistics and you think about human history. I mean, think about this. 70% of the world's wealth is controlled by 5% of the population. The majority of the 5% of the population live in the United States of America. That would be you and I, right? We are incredibly rich. Now, I know you're going to push back and say, well, I don't feel rich, and I would be with you. I don't feel rich, right? I get that, but we are. If you were to look at all of human history and put a data point in the United States of America, there's no other point in human history that you've seen this much affluence and this much prosperity. We are incredibly, incredibly rich. And even with that, not one time in a decade has anyone ever sat down and said, I just need to confess that I struggle with greed. Because greed isn't confessed. And we could go on, but just one more, is that the power of greed is not to ask. The power of greed is not to ask the hard questions. Not to sit down and ask yourself the question, how can I be more generous? How can I give more money away? How can I leverage what I have? How can I kind of sacrifice some of the things in my life or lifestyle so I can be more generous to the city, more generous to the poor, more generous to things going around the world, more generous to the local church? We don't ask ourselves that question. We don't sit down with individuals and go, hey, here's all of my finances. Here's my budget. Here's how much I make. Here's all my investments. Here's all my debts. Here's everything. Can you look at this? Because I know greed's going to blind me. Can you look at this and tell me how I can be more radically generous to the poor, be more radically generous to the city or to the local church? We don't ask the hard questions. And guys, I'm with you. I'm talking to me today. I don't want to ask those hard questions of myself. I want to ask questions, how can I get that next Apple product? For me, that's what I want to think about. Or how can I get that next gadget? Or how can I kind of one up my last vacation? That was so much fun with Jill or so much fun with the boys. How can we make it even better and better? I want more and more. That's in me. I think it's in all of us. But I think one of the reasons why we don't ask the hard questions is because greed blinds us. So, what do we do with that? How do you know if greed has you? How do you know if you're free from greed? Well, Jesus tells us. He wraps up the whole passage, and he's so direct. And again, remember, this is Jesus' words, so argue with him a little bit. So here's what he says. He says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Well, Jesus, can't you have it both ways? Can I serve a little bit of God and a little bit of money? Again, Jesus would say no. These are mutually exclusive things. One will always come under the other. One will always serve the other. You're either going to be devoted to God and everything will fall under that, or you're going to be devoted to money and everything will fall under that. You have to pick who you're going to be devoted to. To which we hear all of this. And if you and I were talking having coffee, having this discussion, this is confusing because we're like, well, I don't know if I'm greedy or not. I don't know if money has my heart or not. I don't know. Some days I feel like, I don't know what, is it God or money? Some days I think I just don't know. This is hard to know if money has me or not. And guys, this is why guardrails are so incredibly important. Because those subjects in life that are just kind of like, I don't know, this is kind of one of those things we struggle with, or there's some danger or things that can really lead to some of the greatest regrets in life, but I'm not really sure where I'm at. That's why guardrails are so important. Because a personal guardrail, by definition, is this. A personal guardrail is a standard of behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. That there's a guardrail we establish in our life, or a question that we ask in our life, that when we bump into it, kind of lights up our conscience. And it's kind of like, watch out, pay attention, danger, danger, danger. And when it comes to the subject of money, because we are some of the greatest, strategists, some of the greatest conversationalists to talk ourselves into things, to deceive ourselves, we've got to have financial guardrails that light up our conscience and say, perhaps money has our heart. So, what are those? So today, as we wrap up our time, I want to give you 3 questions. And these 3 questions, the purpose of these questions are kind of to light up kind of your conscience, to be guardrails, to go, does money have my heart, or does God have my heart? And hopefully this provides some clarity. So here are the questions. Here are the financial guardrails. The first question is this. How do you react to rich people? Again, this is for you personally. Just think about this. When you're around somebody who's extraordinarily rich, how do you act? What happens to you? What do you have a tendency to say and not say? Because I think about this personally. I think about, a few years ago when I was working at Dell and Jill and I were first, starting to date. I remember Jill and I were walking down the stairs at Dell, to kind of exit. It's the end of the day. We're going home. And right behind us, as we're walking down the stairs, we kind of look over our shoulder, is Michael Dell. He's like 5 feet away. And he does that thing that, people do who are polite. He's like, hey, how's it going? And Jill and I, in that moment, were like, oh my gosh. And for me personally, I was like, I don't know how it's going. I don't know what to say. I mean, whatever. Are you going to fire me if I say the wrong thing? Are you going to like me? Are you not going to? I mean, all these things begin to race. My mind is racing because I'm like, he's a billionaire, right behind me, 5 feet behind me. And my mind kind of went blank and my blood pressure went up. So my question is for you. When you're around somebody who's extraordinarily wealthy, how do you react to it? What happens inside of you? Is there envy that comes out? Is there that idea about, well, that's just not fair, maybe some jealousy? I should have that. I deserve that. I mean, I work 10 times as hard as them. They have some silver spoon or some inheritance. I mean, I deserve that. Is it envy? Is there disdain to go, how dare they? How dare they have that much money? How dare they have that big of a house? How dare they have that many cars? How dare they have that many experiences with their kids? I mean, do we begin to look down at our noses at the rich and somehow think we're superior? For you, how do you react around the rich? See, Jesus says when God has your heart, when we stand and we go, oh my gosh, you gave everything from me, my security, my hope, my identity, my worth, my value, my significance is all found in you, then we can just love the rich. We can look at people who are extraordinarily wealthy and go, oh, you're just made in the image of God. And you have value and worth and significance regardless of how much or how little you have. Think about that. Question number 2, financial guardrail. Do you respect the poor? When you're around the poor and they, and you're engaged in a conversation or whatever it may be, what happens inside of you? Do you respect the poor? As I think about this with my kids, if my kids ask me all the time when we're around the poor and there's somebody who, may look a different way or smell a different way or, they could tell that something's different. They'll ask me the question, Dad, what happened? Dad, what happened? What's going on with them? And I'll be honest, there are times that my heart, the temptation is to go, well, they should just work harder. They should just take advantage of the opportunities. I mean, there's so many opportunities. They should just work harder, take advantage of the opportunities, use their God-given intellect. And when my heart is that hard and goes there, money's got my heart. So how about you? When you're around the poor, do you respect them? Do you desire to learn from them? Do you have thoughts of, oh my gosh, you know what? If I had their mom, if I had their dad, if I grew up in their kind of family, if I had that circumstance, grew up in that condition, I bet with all my IQ and all my abilities, I bet I would probably be in the exact same situation. So tell me more of your story. Tell me more about you. Do you respect and learn from them? Or when you're around the poor, do you kind of look down your nose at them and say, hey, you just need to work a little harder? Third question, and perhaps this one will create the tension. Are you sacrificially generous? This is a financial guardrail. When you think about your income, when you think about your finances and how, everything comes in and goes out, are you sacrificially generous? Are you looking for opportunities to give more money away to the city, to the poor, to things around the world, to the local church? Are you looking at your budget and maybe even saying, bringing somebody in, a trusted mentor and say, hey, can you help me become more radically and sacrificially generous? You see, when it comes to generosity, oftentimes we ask the question, what's the mark? What's the goal? How generous do I have to be sacrificial or for God, to kind of be happy? And if you've grown up in the church, perhaps you've heard the idea of the tithe. Tithe just simply means 10%. And for a lot of us, I would say if you're trying to get there, like you're on your way there, if you're at 10%, for a lot of us, that's sacrificial. I mean, we got to change our lifestyles to give 10%. That's a big, big deal. But more and more in the United States of America, people can give 10% away, and it won't even impact their lifestyle. And the tithe is not the standard. The standard is the cross of Jesus Christ. And what did Jesus give at the cross Did he give 10%? 10% of his blood, 10% of his body was spilled, He gave 100%. He gave everything for you and for me because you and I are his treasure. That's the standard. That's the point. To be sacrificial, to look at what you have and go, how can I adjust my lifestyle to be sacrificial in my generosity? Now, I know a lot of times when we hear that, we're like, well, this is where the rub kind of comes. This is where it's, because this is where I feel like God just wants something from me. I go to church and I'm hearing like, okay, God wants this from you and you have to do this. And I get that. Again, I get where that comes from. But today I want to clear up for all of us that God is not trying to get something from you, that God wants something for you. He really does. In fact, think about this. The latest research, the most exhaustive study on generosity, regardless if you're a Christian or not. This was not a religious study. This was just done general in generosity. The largest study done was by the University of Notre Dame. And the professors at the University of Notre Dame looked at all these different stories and all these different lives and followed them for a long period of time and said, okay, what does generosity do in your life? When you are radically generous, sacrificially generous, what happens in your life? And they actually put it in a book, and you can read this book and verify everything I'm saying. It's called The Paradox of Generosity. It's a fantastic book. And here's what Christian and Hillary's conclusion of the whole study is. They said this: the more generous Americans are, the more happiness, health, and purpose in life they enjoy. I promise you, God's not trying to get something from you. He wants something for you. He wants you to be free from greed. He wants your heart to be free from the love of money. And he wants you to experience the happiness, joy, and purpose in your life. And come on, you have experienced this. I mean, when you buy the gadgets and gizmos and stuff, I mean, that's kind of cool, and that lasts for what, maybe a couple months, couple weeks, couple days, couple years. But then it fades. It's an appetite. You got to keep getting and getting and getting, and you spend and spend and spend, right? But when you begin to invest in life change, when you begin to invest in things that are transcendent, when you begin to hear stories like Dean and all the different stories, when you begin to see what happens in the life, in the hearts of your sons and daughters, I mean, that's the transcendent things that lead to purpose, that lead to lasting happiness and lasting joy. That's what God wants for you. So let me ask one last time. How do you react to rich people? Do you respect poor people? Are you sacrificially generous? God doesn't want something from you. I honestly can say, objectively can say, he wants something for you. He wants you to be free from the love of money, free from greed, and experience lasting happiness, joy, and purpose. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your grace. Father, you know every single one of our hearts. And you know, this is an area personally that is so difficult for me. And I'm not only talking to everybody, but I'm talking to me today. And you know that. And so, Father, I just pray that you meet all of us where we're at. I pray that you extend a lot of grace and a lot of patience with us. And I ultimately pray that you give us the courage to trust you and to experience what you have for us. God, I trust you with that. Thank you for today. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.